All right, we are going to begin a time of teaching, and we are going to be in the little book called Jonah in the Old Testament. So if you brought a Bible, find the book of Jonah in the Old Testament. You're going to need to use the table of contents to find it. It's not the easiest book to find. In fact, I've been studying it for the last 6 weeks or so, and I fumbled around to find my way to it this morning. It's just that difficult. It's about 2 pages long, and so you'll miss it. Just use the table of contents to find it, the book called Jonah. If you didn't bring a Bible, there are some paperback ones down the ends of your row, and you can have someone slide that down to you. There's a table of contents in those. There's also lots of Jonahs floating around in the clouds, and so if you Google Jonah on your smartphone, it'll put it onto your home screen, and we're going to be looking at chapter 1 today. It'll really help you to be able to read along because we're going to read all of chapter 1 together. And so this will be a lot more meaningful if you're able to read along, either in the Bible you brought, the Bible on the end of your row, one of the many, many cloud Bibles. We're starting a new series today. It's only going to last a few weeks, but it's in this famous little book in the Bible called Jonah. And in fact, if you're not a church person, or maybe you're not normally a Bible reader, you still might have heard this story before because it's one of the most popular stories from ancient literature. And if you haven't heard it, that's all right. I get to introduce it to you, which I'm excited to do. The book of Jonah is named after the main character who was a prophet in Israel. In fact, best we can tell, he might have been the earliest prophet for who we have a book named after in the Old Testament. He lived about 780 BC. And a prophet's job in Israel was to listen to God and to reveal things to Israel that would not have been obvious to them if they did not have a prophet to reveal it to them. So anytime we read one of the prophets, we should expect that God is trying to show his people something that they were not seeing clearly, maybe something that we don't see clearly. Now, rather than telling you what this thing is that God is trying to show Israel that they were not seeing, rather than just telling you the point of that up front, I want us just to discover it together like the original audience would have discovered it, because this book is an incredible story. It's full of surprising twists, and I don't want to ruin a good story with a mediocre introduction. And so I'm just going to let you experience it as it unfolds. And today we are going to read chapter 1 together, and I'll point out some things to notice as we go. And as we're reading, you might just be asking yourself, what is this story about? What is God trying to show Israel that they would not have seen otherwise, and they needed a prophet to reveal it to them? What's he trying to show us? So let's pick up the story. It starts in Jonah chapter 1, verse 1, and it begins like this. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise and go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. Now, this book starts with a standard prophetic commission. In fact, if you read the other prophets, you'll hear this over and over and over again. The word of the Lord came to Malachi. The word of the Lord came to Obadiah. The word of the Lord came to Joel. The word of the Lord came to Isaiah. The word of the Lord comes to the prophet. And usually when the word of the Lord comes to the prophet, it involves two things, a message and a mission. So there is a message from God, and there's a mission to take that message, usually to one of the kings of Israel or to the people of Israel. So Jonah has a message, and he has a mission. Arise and go to Nineveh, that great city, that's his mission, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. That's the message he's going to deliver. Now, the dominant world empire in that day was called Assyria, and Nineveh was their capital. And so he's called to go to that great city, Nineveh, and it's called great because great means big. It didn't mean great like we mean great, like it's a nice place to live with good restaurants and parks and local coffee roasters. What a great city. It meant really big. There were 600 to 700,000 people who lived in Nineveh, which was huge in the ancient era for a city. That's bigger than Denver proper is today. 600 to 700,000 people. Capital of the great world empire, Assyria. And these Assyrians were known for their brutality. When they conquered a territory, they killed everyone in their path. They beheaded them, and they were known to pile up the heads of their conquest in pyramids in the middle of the cities they conquered. They had also perfected a technique for skinning their captives alive in order to keep them alive as long as possible and torture them. So they were kind of like ancient ISIS. And a lot of their expansion was achieved simply by fear. So if Assyria announced that they were interested in you, the kings of the little smaller kingdoms so feared the Assyrians that they would cut deals with them and become vassal states of them instead of being invaded by the Assyrians, because who wants to be skinned alive? And so Jonah is commissioned to go to their capital and to call out against it and to let them know that God has taken notice of their evil. That's his message, and that's his mission. Now, this message is just classic Orthodox Jewish theology, because the God of the Jewish people, which is the same God we worship, had revealed himself with the name Yahweh, which means I will be who I will be. And they called him the Lord, the capital L Lord. And what he meant by that is that he's not just a tribal deity like he's just the Lord of Israel, but he's the Lord of all the earth and everything that he has created. As such, he has the ability to raise up and to take down whoever he wants to raise up and whoever he wants to take down, including all the kings of all the kingdoms of the earth, including the king of the biggest kingdom of the earth, Assyria. We have another prophet in our Old Testament who lived about 250 years after Jonah. His name is Daniel. He also wrote a book. And the great world empire of Daniel's day was Babylon, under the great king Nebuchadnezzar, one of the famous kings in ancient history. And Daniel's primary ministry was to tell the kings of Babylon that they were not the ultimate authority in the world. Now, the kings of Babylon would not have just naturally understood that, given their own wisdom. They needed a prophet to tell them that, because as far as the kings of Babylon were concerned, as far as their experience led them to believe they were the king of the world. And so God raised up this little prophet, Daniel, and he says, tell the kings of Babylon that there is a Lord over them who sets up kings and removes kings as he wishes. Jonah was commissioned to say the same thing to Nineveh. To say, in effect, there's a God over you and he knows you're evil. In fact, it's come up before him, meaning he is getting ready to, or as the prophets used to say, he is fixing to do something about it. That's his message. Now, obviously, that's a risky mission, because not only does he have to go to this ruthless city and proclaim this message, before he can even get there, he's going to have to go 500 miles overland. Nineveh is 500 miles northeast of Israel, so he's going to have to travel 500 miles. And Jonah, when you get there, I want you to go into this city that skins their enemies alive. You're going to be outnumbered about 600,000 to 1. And tell them the Lord, the God you don't worship, but who made you, he's seen your evil. Hey, good luck with that. But Jonah's a prophet. That's his job. He has to take the message and the mission that God has given him. He's got to go to Nineveh and call out against it. That's how the story begins. Now, verse 3. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish, so he paid the fare and went on board to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. Tarshish was about 2,500 miles across the Mediterranean Sea. It was the western edge of the known world for Jewish people. So Nineveh is 500 miles to the east across the land. Tarshish is 2,500 miles to the west across the sea. It was the furthest known point that you could travel. So here's the picture. God gives Jonah a message and a mission to go to Nineveh and call out against them. And he says, what is the furthest place away from Nineveh across the sea I've ever heard of? Tarshish. Now's a good time to check that out. I've never been there. I've always wondered what Tarshish is like. So he goes down to Joppa, which was a seaport to the south, looks for a ship, a cargo ship that's going to Tarshish. It was customary in that day, you could ride on a cargo ship by paying a fare and hopping on board. And so he goes to Tarshish, he pays the fare, and he heads with them. He goes to Joppa, pays the fare, heads with them to Tarshish. Oh, that's the setup for the story. Now, it'd be natural to think right here that Jonah doesn't want to be skinned alive at Nineveh. That's why he's running. But there's a little detail that would have pricked the ears of the Jewish audience. You heard it twice in verse 3. Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord, paid the fare, went on board to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. The Hebrew word for presence literally meant the face of the Lord. God's face was not his general presence that is manifested in his creation. It's his personal, I know you presence. There's two ways you can be in someone's presence. Most of us have been to a large event where there's a celebrity performing on the stage or on the court or on the field, the kind of things that happen in stadiums and arenas. And so we're in the presence of the great celebrity when we go to such events. A couple of months ago, I went to a U2 concert at the Pepsi Center. Do you guys know who U2 is? Okay. I've discovered that younger people don't know about the U2, but they have a lead singer named Bono, and they have a famous guitar player named The Edge. And we were there. I was there in the same big room with them. And so in that sense, I was in their presence, kinda, with 20,000 other people. But one night, about 10 years ago, the three of us happened to be in the same town at the same night, the three of us, me, Bono, and The Edge. And I got a call from my brother, and he said, I'm down here at a such and such a place. This was a private place. It was a secured place. It wasn't a public place, but he says, I'm down here at such and such a place, and Bono and The Edge are here, and there's not many people here. I said, I'm on my way. And so when I got there, a little Irish man, not much bigger than me, came up and introduced himself. He said, hello, I'm Bono, as if I didn't know. And I got to spend a few minutes talking to him in his presence, face to face. I smelled his breath. Smelled like liquor. I said, is that gin on your breath? He said, no, man, it's vodka. That's a whole different way of being in his presence than I was at Pepsi Center. In one sense, you can be in God's presence as long as you're in the big arena where he is, the world that he made. But you can also know his face, and his personal attention can be directed toward you. So Jonah is a Jewish prophet. He knows you can never escape from the arena of God's presence, the world. I mean, he's got some good theology, as we're going to figure out here in a minute. But you can run from his face. You can run from his personal attention toward you. That's what he's doing. Now, right here, he's forsaken his calling, because a prophet's job was to know God face to face and to represent what God is like to the people. The prophet was supposed to be able to tell you what God's breath smells like. But Jonah is doing the opposite here. He's paid the fare to go away from the presence of the Lord. He's doing more than saying no to his mission. There's something about God's personal presence. There's something about who he is and what he's like and what his breath smells like that Jonah doesn't like, and he runs from it. Now, the question that's going to hang over this story to the end, and the narrator didn't answer the question here. And hopefully I don't have to answer the question until we get there, though I was thinking about next week I might have to answer the question to help you understand next week. But the question that hangs over this story to the end is, what is it about God that Jonah does not like and wants to get away from? That's the setup. Now I'll pick it up in verse 4. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. Now the sea in ancient world was a place of chaos. The sea was dangerous, it was chaotic, it was uncontrollable. And when the sea was stirred up into a storm, they thought that the gods did it, that it was a sign of the gods' displeasure, God's personal displeasure toward them. Which it turns out that's kind of what's happening here. And so the Lord sends his personal presence after Jonah, hurls a great wind upon the sea. There was a mighty tempest on the sea. The ship threatened to break up. The mariners were afraid. Each cried out to his God. And all the Jewish readers are going, well, that's not going to work. because they're not crying out to the God who caused the tempest in the first place. But they don't know any better. They're just crying out to the best God that they know to cry out to. Their little G gods, they're just crying out to them. They don't know any better what to do. But they didn't work, so they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. The one guy who actually knows the reason for the storm and actually knows the God who can do something about it is asleep. Now, sleeping in the middle of the crisis is a familiar theme in Hebrew Scriptures, especially in the Psalms, and it can mean two different things. It could mean that you're so confident in the goodness and sovereignty of God that you're sleeping, because what's to worry about? If you fly on airplanes for very long, you'll quickly learn through experience that airplanes don't crash because of turbulence. So when the plane starts bouncing around after you've been on planes for a while, you know just to get your book out and keep reading and don't freak out. So that's one way to sleep in the middle of a storm. The other way to sleep in the middle of a storm is because you're indifferent or you don't care what's going on. Now, you see this in the Psalms, for example. In Psalm 3, David is fleeing from his enemies, and he writes this in the middle of his flight. Psalm chapter 3, verse 3, "But you, O Lord, are a shield about me." Like, I've got some protection here. "My glory and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. So I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves all around me." So thousands of men are chasing him to kill him, and in the middle of that hot pursuit, he lays down and goes to sleep. That's confidence. Confidence in God. But you can also sleep when you're ignorant or indifferent. And in Psalm chapter 44, the psalmist even starts to wonder if God is sleeping like this. Here's what he says: "Awake, why are you sleeping, O Lord? Rouse yourself. Do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face? Why do you forget our affliction and oppression?" Now, which kind of sleep do you think Jonah is sleeping? Is this a man who is so confident in God that he's sleeping while these pagans panic? Or does he not care? I think he doesn't care. His heart is so tuned into what he is trying to accomplish for his own purposes. He doesn't care about these guys that he's roped into the journey. So he's gone to the innermost part of the ship. He's asleep. Verse 6. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish." By the way, we have no evidence that Jonah did that. We have no evidence that he called out to his God. We have no evidence that he prayed for them. The story just continues, verse 7. "And they said to one another, 'Come, let us cast lots that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us.'" Casting lots in that day was a way that you could get a very quick and specific answer from God about something. "Let us cast lots that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you?" And he said to them, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." That's very, very right, orthodox answer. Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. At this point, Jonah has been completely cornered. The presence, the personal attention of the Lord toward him has chased him down through the storm and has now revealed him and shined a bright light on him through the casting of lots. He's totally found out. And the question is, what's he going to do now that he's found out? Verse 11. "Then they said to him, 'What shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you, for I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. This is Jonah's only sorta, kinda, noble-ish moment in the story. He finally agrees to do the right thing, to give in to God's personal pursuit by being thrown into the sea, which will mean his death. So Jonah has learned you can't outrun God, and when you try to outrun him, dead. Verse 13. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, the same Lord they had just learned about. O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered sacrifices to the Lord and made vows. So here's Jonah's prophetic career so far. He gets a message and he gets a mission. The word of the Lord comes to him, but there's something about that word of the Lord that disturbs him about God. And so he runs from the face of God. He tries to flee to Tarshish. He buys passage on a boat, thereby putting everyone in the boat in danger. When danger comes, he sleeps the sleep of indifference through the storm, refuses to even pray for them, doesn't own up to what he's done until they cast lots and God shines a spotlight on him. And finally he gives up and he's thrown into the sea. Now, were you watching the sailors during this episode? Look at what they were doing. Look at verse 12. He said to them, pick me up, hurl me into the sea, then the sea will be quiet for you. For I know it's because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land. So they're doing everything they can to spare him. They have incredible mercy on this man who has put them in danger. And then when they know that they're going to have to throw him into the sea, which is going to mean his certain death, in verse 14, they call out to the Lord and they say, O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life. Lay not on us innocent blood. They know that they now face another danger, which is that they could receive the curse of having shed an innocent man's blood. So they pray that they would not perish for having ended an innocent man's life. Now, that's the prayer that Jonah should have prayed for them. Jonah should have prayed, Lord, don't let these men perish because of me. Don't let me shed innocent blood. But they prayed the prayer for him. So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea. The sea ceased from its raging. It's like the wrath of the God who caused the raging sea was appeased. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord, and they made vows. Now that doesn't just mean that they had a little religious ceremony on the deck of the ship before going on. This is not, they sang a couple of songs and burned some incense and sacrificed a fish. A sacrifice is a giving of something costly. We don't know what they sacrificed, but it had to be something costly to them. And a vow is a promise to do something in the future as a result of what God has done for you. That was the Orthodox Jewish response to God's mercy. When you experience God's mercy and his kindness, you went to the temple and you made a sacrifice and you made vows. But these aren't Jewish men. They've just seen how God spared them, and having seen the kindness and the mercy of this Lord, and having watched how this Lord pursued this one man, they pledged themselves to that same Lord. They in effect said, we're going to now follow him for our lives. They said in effect, we need to know this God. This God is higher than our gods. Now, here's the original question we ask. What is this story all about? What is God trying to show Israel that they wouldn't have naturally noticed and they needed a prophet to reveal it to him? What's he trying to show us? This story establishes a very interesting pattern that goes something like this. God's prophet who represented God's people and some pagans. And we mean that in the best sense of the term. Pagans is not a pejorative term. It just means people who don't know the Lord and don't know any better. God's prophet, representing God's people, and some pagans are together in the same situation. They literally in the same boat. Same situation, same boat. They have the same need for the storm to be calmed. And they need the same God to calm the storm. They need the same God to do what only He can do to save them. Same boat, same storm, same need, same God that they need. But the prophet doesn't perceive it, nor does he care. He is asleep. He can only be forced to do the right thing when God finally corners him. Meanwhile, the so-called pagans are totally open to knowing him, and the prophet is oblivious, and the prophet doesn't care. Now, what do you think God's saying to Israel? He's asking, do you guys see? Do you care? Israel's original charter went all the way back to their first patriarch, who was named Abraham. Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. Jacob wrestled with God and was renamed Israel, which means one who wrestles with God. Jacob/Israel had 12 sons, and these 12 sons became the founding fathers of 12 tribes of people who grew into be the people Israel. So they traced their lineage all the way back to Abraham and to the original charter that God gave Abraham. And here's the original charter that God gave Abraham way back in Genesis chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So he intended these people who were going to come from Abraham to be a blessing to all people, and he said, "In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." He said, in effect, I'm going to put you in the middle of the world, in the same world, for them. But by Jonah's day, they had pretty much forgotten that. They had written off the pagans as evil and out of reach, and they really only cared about Israel, which is exactly what Jonah lived out on the boat. But while Jonah was indifferent to these people, God showed these same people his mercy and his kindness. He showed mercy and kindness to the sailors. So here's the theme we're beginning to see. In fact, this theme's going to carry throughout this little book. Sometimes God's people don't represent God's heart. Sometimes God's people, even when they believe the right things about God, even when they have the right formulas to describe who God is and what He's like, even when they know He's the one true God above all gods, He's the Lord of lords, He's the one who, let's quote Jonah, made the sea and the dry land, the Lord, the God of heaven. Sometimes, even when they know that, they don't know His heart. They don't represent what He is like. They don't know Him face to face. Now, at the end of the book, we're going to find out Jonah knows about God's mercy. He can describe it orthodoxly. He just doesn't represent it or embody it. So this book stood as a challenge to Israel. Is your heart God's heart? Do you guys have a God who is about blessing you and giving you good things, a God who's about helping you get a date and meet the one and find a job and get that elusive parking spot downtown? But He's really not the God for your friends or for the world. That's the challenge to Israel. Maybe that's the challenge to us. But this story also teaches and reveals some things about God Himself. This book also stood as a hopeful book for the nations, that even when God's people don't accurately represent what God is like, even when God's people don't have God's heart, God still has God's heart. He still wants to show you what He's like. God's prophet, His servant, His spokesman, Jonah, and God Himself are so not alike. And yet, at the end of the story, these sailors have come to know God as he is. In fact, God used an imperfect messenger to reach them with that message. He put them in a situation where they would need him to save them, and he sent them a very imperfect messenger, and he still showed them what he was like in the midst of this situation. Now that means if like you're not a follower of Jesus, maybe you're not a God worshiper, you can still know what God is like. You can look through the messengers, you can look through the church. You can look through the prophets who haven't represented God's heart to you. You can see what God's like. Some of you have been hurt by Jonah Christians. Perhaps they spoke some truth to you, but they didn't really care that much. They made it seem like maybe you're just kind of hopeless. And so now you're invited to follow the example of these sailors who came to see through a rotten messenger what God himself is like. This God cares about you. This God does not want you to perish. This is a God who gives mercy to people who cry out to him for mercy. This is a God who wants to show himself to you. So this is a story about what Jonah's like, but this is also a story about what God's like. God and Jonah are not the same. And throughout this story, the character of God becomes more and more and more clear as the character of Jonah also becomes more and more and more clear. Now, there's one more little revelation in this story, this first chapter of what God is like. When we left the story, Jonah had been chased down by God. He had been pitched into the sea. He'd been given up for dead. God's personal presence had pursued him to throw him into the sea and to get him. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, there's 3 chapters after chapter 1. So there's more of Jonah to come. And there's one more verse in chapter 1. It went like this. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Now, it's going to become clear, God did not appoint that fish to eat Jonah and kill him. He appointed that great fish to preserve Jonah and to save his life. Now, if you've heard the story before, this is why you've heard it. And some people read this and go, well, I mean, it has to be some kind of myth or fairy tale. Fish can't swallow up people. People don't live inside fish. I get that. Okay, so here are some things to think about. First of all, fish here is not a technical term referring to a creature with a vertebrae and scales and fins and gills. It's a general term that means sea creature. It could be any kind of sea creature. Doesn't just have to be a fish. This is why in some tellings of the story, it's a whale that swallowed up Jonah. Because scientific people, we know whales aren't fish, they're mammals. But they are sea creatures. So it could have been some other kind of sea creature that swallowed up Jonah. Second thing that kind of is pretty convincing, at least to me, is that God commissioned this sea creature. And since I also believe that he's the Lord of all the creation, he can do with whatever he wants to do with the creation, that God can do whatever he wants to do, even if it means using sea creatures to save people. He can do that. In fact, the whole of this book reads like history. It doesn't read like a fairy tale. It reads like history. Nineveh was a real place. Jonah was a real person. The events, all the rest of the events in this book happened, so why not think that that one happened? And Jesus himself talked of this as if Jonah was real and this really happened. And when all else fails and I can't understand stuff in the scriptures, I just go with what Jesus thinks, because I tend to think Jesus was the smartest person who's ever lived, that he sees a little bit more clearly than me. And so if Jesus thought it happened, I'm with the guy who rose from the dead. But if none of that is convincing, then you have permission to believe that this is just some kind of story illustrating a point, because I don't want you to miss the point here. This fish was sent to save and to preserve Jonah. So what does God do for his imperfect prophet whose heart is far from him? He runs after him and he pursues him. And then he does the same thing that he did with the pagan sailors. He preserves them. He comes to them with mercy. He preserves Jonah. He comes to Jonah with mercy. God's presence, when it finally catches up with Jonah, is a merciful presence. Jonah is going to get another chance for his mission and message in the rest of this book. And this is saying, look at the God who does this. This is a God who, when he turns his personal presence now, he has left a broad era of history that's been going on for thousands of years, that when he turns his personal presence to people, even when he wreaks havoc in your life, he has not done that to kill you, but to save you and to show his mercy to you and to bring you to a place where you have to have his mercy. Now, 800 years after Jonah, there was a very, very similar story in the life and the ministry of Jesus. Jesus, in his very early days of his ministry, when people were still trying to figure out, like, who is this guy and what is he like? He's been ministering in his hometown of Capernaum, and Capernaum is on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. He's been ministering in Capernaum, and he decides to take his disciples in a boat, go across the Sea of Galilee, which granted is much smaller than the Mediterranean, but still it was a place that was not easy to cross. And he's with his disciples in a boat going across the Sea of Galilee. This is how the gospel writer Mark tells that story in Mark chapter 4. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with them, and a great windstorm arose. And the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling, but he, Jesus, was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. Now remember, you can sleep through a storm for one of two reasons. Either you're really, really confident in God, or you don't care. His disciples are getting ready to jump to a conclusion. He was asleep in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he woke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" No one even had to go into the sea to calm it down. No one had to be thrown into the sea of God's wrath to calm the sea. Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Now here's what they were going to find out, who this is. This is a man who perfectly represents both the message and the face of God. This is a man who perfectly reveals what it is that God wants to say to the world. And this is a man who perfectly reveals what God is like. If we have seen him, we've seen God. There is no disjunction. There is no space between the message and the person of Jesus and the message and the person of God. They are one and the same. There's no difference between what Jesus' breath smells like and what God's breath smells like. They smell the same. They are one in the same. Perfect messenger from God. Perfect revelation of what God is like. So if you want to know this God, look at the perfect messenger and the perfect revelation of what he's like. And here's what the disciples began to discover in the boat. He cares. He cares about them. He's not going to let them perish. No one had to go in the sea for the sea to be calmed. And the reason Jesus could just stand up and go, "Peace, be calm," is because a couple of years after this, he was thrown into the sea of God's wrath himself. And he sat there in the sea for 3 days and 3 nights. The Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Jesus would later call his death and his resurrection the sign of Jonah. He was thrown into the sea for 3 days and 3 nights until the sea of God's wrath became calm. That's why he could appear to have been sleeping. He could have been sleeping. Because if you're with him and you're connected to him, no storm could be God's wrath, requiring you to be consumed by God's wrath for it to be calmed. That's already been taken care of. Every storm is just God's kindness pursuing you so he can show you his mercy and show you what he's like. That's what God is like, which is a little bit hard to tell if you're looking at Jonah, but it's not that hard to tell if you're looking at Jesus. Let's pray together. Father, I pray that you would use the book of Jonah to give us hope that we can know you. We can know you even when preachers and prophets and churches and people and Jesus followers are imperfect, even when they don't know your heart. This is what your heart is like. And so I pray that we would, ultimately, this book would point us to our need for a perfect revelation of you, for a perfect revelation of your message and a perfect revelation of what you are like. And so we would use this book to look through it and look through Jonah to your son, Jesus. And in Jesus, we see your holy, righteous wrath and your mercy. We see them reconciled. We see them reconciled because he went into the sea to make it calm for us. And so, Father, I pray that if anyone here is in the seas today, that they would be connected to Jesus and thereby know that this sea is not your anger toward them. It might be your good fatherly discipline to bring them closer to you or to you for the first time, but it's not your anger toward them. And Father, if anyone is here, they don't know your son, I pray that they would know him. They would know him because he's gone into the sea for them so that they don't have to go into the sea themselves. And then having that, they can know that all of your actions toward them now are mercy and kindness and grace. We ask it in his name and by his Spirit. Amen.